Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Euramerican National Assembly. I am Mr. R, and with me today I have Mr. Ed, Don, and Mr. Black. So today we're going to be discussing basically how to avoid unnecessary problem interactions with a group, really how to avoid topics that you don't need to fight about, infighting and purity spiraling and that sort of thing, and also how to manage people who are a problem for the group and in a reasonable way. I think Mr. Ed has a lot prepared on this, and I'm really going to kind of let him run this topic today. But I guess I'll start with saying, one of the things that we've run into, fairly early is that there are topics that are somewhat fraught with, potential conflict that just isn't necessary. And if you're trying to organize a group like this, you want to use some strategy to avoid, both you yourself and also try to condition your group to do this too. You just avoid having fights that you don't need to have. So one thing that's been a problem for us historically is being divided up into, little smaller and smaller groups, and you don't want that. You want as many people as are able to contribute to our cause, to our movement, working together as possible. So topics that, we tend to, that we're going to talk about how to be careful with, things like religion. Exact details of political ideology, I think, are things that you want to avoid as well, and we can talk about the details of that. But I'm really going to kind of hand it over to Mr. Ed at this point to kind of take it away from here.
Hi, Mr. Ed. So first of all, when you introduced the idea of this, I was going, well, this is a pretty difficult topic to talk about. I've got my own ideas, and I think we'll get into my own views and experiences over time. But I thought, hey, let's ask the experts what they say. So I went out and I dug up some presentations associated with, quote unquote, dealing with difficult people. And maybe I'll just kind of go over some of these. So we've got kind of the ideal situation and the responses to difficulties there. So I've got a presentation by a group called Align, and it's the topic of the presentation is dealing with difficult people. And they say their objective is to define what difficult is, define conflict, review a 5-step process for dealing with difficult people, and review a communication model. And my first initial attitude towards this is that's great when you're working in a work setting and with very cooperative people who have who come together with known ideas and goals up front, which is what I would say you generally have in a work environment. In a volunteer association, like a lot of us deal with, I think it's not necessarily the best. But if it's okay with you, let me just real quickly go through some of this.
Sure. Yeah, I think there could be some good principles or concepts to use, and then we can talk more about what we've done ourselves so far.
Sure. So the first one in this presentation is what is difficult, and they say it's not easy or uncomfortable. And they say what is conflict, communications, and problem solving. In a lot of cases, a lot of people are what they call lawfully neutral, and that means, they're willing to be very flexible, but that's not always the situation. And that's the next slide, which says sometimes you do care about the outcome. And so and I would say that's where conflict arises, is when people have different visions for either what you're standing for or how to go about accomplishing it. And so conflict, I always think conflict is, first of all, a natural thing. People have different ideals, different visions, different views of how to do things, and that is the conflict. The problem is, how does that conflict get realized? And that can be negotiation, it can be discussion, it can be arguing, it can be very bad things. I mean, we're seeing right now in the world, we're seeing conflict going on between Russia, Ukraine, U.S., Britain. So all of these have different visions for what should be going on in that area. So, and how do they deal with it? They're killing each other. So, conflict is a very important thing. I mean, take it seriously because it'll break apart a group. So this, again, I just, I thought if we were going to do something of value is let's kind of look at what these people are saying.
Yeah, I think. Do we want to maybe talk about some examples of the different visions or goals that people within our group have sort of butted heads with each other on so far? Well, not even within just our group, but other groups that we've been a part of too. One thing I've seen is political ideology. We all, in terms of different goals or visions, we all need to be on board with a big picture common vision, right? That has to be the same, that we want a better future for our people, our folk. But beyond that, the exact details of how that's accomplished politically and what that ideology is, people have different views, and I think that's totally fine. It's difficult because I have views, and you have, everyone here has their own views. I think ours are pretty similar to each other. But you don't want to just enforce your views on a whole group too. You want to try to figure out which of your views are necessary and which of your views are just opinions. Which of them are requirements and which ones are I guess more flexible. And I think that's something I've struggled with so far, is what's really, really important here and what isn't in terms of the politics.
I mean, just as an example, at our last picnic, someone was distributing what I would consider fairly strong literature, and I had to ask them, please don't do that. I mean, we're a different organization with different ideas, trying to do something, and I want to work with this guy. So, I try to sit down and I try to discuss with this person, and a lot of people who have, quote unquote, been in the movement or are in the movement have developed ideas which are very far from the ordinary, and they come to expect that people who don't accept the views that they've come to accept as, weak. And my argument to him was, look, this is not weak. The old saying is, before you run, you have to walk, and you can't just hit somebody with, something extreme and so. There's no guarantee they're going to even accept. I don't accept most of the ideas that are quote-unquote movement ideas, even though I'm very pro-white, very active. I got my own, of course I got my own ideas, but I hope that, among me and people I deal with, I try to say, look, we both agree that what's good for white people is correct, right? So let's start there. Start with the end goal or vision, and let's try to find some place in the middle where, if we accept that, how do we go about that? And so, anyway, yeah. I mean, to me, this kind of conflict is very real and happens all the time.
What it seems like to me is, if I might pitch in, to me it seems like we're dealing with people who are very, very fringe even for us, and they seem to think that the methodology for getting political power is more important than the abstract ideal, than the end goal. And that ideal is actually what's most important, because whatever gets you there, in our case it's advocating for white people, that should be, as you said, that should be paramount. But for some people, they latch onto the ways in which they think will get you there faster, and then for some reason they obsess over the means more than the end goal, and then it becomes, well, really, I just want the thing that makes me comfortable. I want the thing that I think is best, and they forget about that abstract end goal.
Yeah. Well, and so, like I was saying, there is conflict in this particular case. I'm just going to use some words here that may not be well accepted. Some people say National Socialism is the way it's got to be done, and anything less than that is unacceptable. And my view is, well, I think I understand what you're talking about, and I don't agree with you on that. I got my own ideas of how we should go about these things, and I don't think you're right about that. So somewhere, and so this gets back to what I said earlier. I think in answer, how do you deal with the difficult people? The first rule is find the common goal that you share. Agree. We're all working towards this, right? How we're going to do it, that's another issue.
Right. For me, in a group setting, I like to look at what is the objective of the group. Any tertiary subjects that we're going to fight about beyond that, that's it. It doesn't have a place in the group. It has to be directly related to what is our goal, how do we get there. In our organization right now, do white people have a comfortable place in the world to live? No. That's a goal I want to get to. Now, once we get there, we can have a discussion on how the politics are handled, how society in general works, the economics work. Those are long off discussions. Until we can get somewhere where we're comfortable to even begin to have those discussions, other than in an abstract kind of offhanded way, you don't need to fight on those subjects. What we're fighting for is white well-being, a place for us to live and be comfortable as our own people. And all the other discussions that come along with that, they can be had at a later time when we're in a position to be able to have those discussions and actually put the discussions into action. Right now, they would all just be a theoretical thing, and then you just end up fighting over theory.
So when you first brought up this subject, how do you deal with difficult people? I was thinking, you don't deal with difficult people. You get rid of them. But no, you're right. Conflict is ubiquitous. How we deal with it, and we've got to deal with differences in viewpoints at some point, and how we're willing to make amends or adjustments for each other's benefit is a real difficult issue.
I think we're also all difficult people at times. I think that's something to keep in mind, that you will be the problem at some points. You will probably be wrong and too rigid in your thinking and too focused on some detail that doesn't matter. That is going to happen, and you have to understand and be constantly reassessing. And so, we do have to deal with difficult people if we want to have a group, unless we just have all of the most amiable people that you can find. And even that, I think there's limitations to how far your group can go if you can't handle these sort of conflicts.
And keep in mind, having a difficult person doesn't mean that they're a useless person.
Right.
That they're not helpful to the movement. Not to bring up religion, but Odin himself said, "I never met a man that was so useless he was good for nothing." So you got to keep in mind that, you're going to have conflict, but that doesn't mean you can't work together at all if you disagree on this subject or that subject. You can just agree just to disagree and move on to the things that continue moving us towards a goal.
And so amplifying on the earlier that I said is what's the first step? The first step is defining your vision, some sort of commonality. And from an organizational standpoint, writing down those common things and saying, this is what we're about, this is what we stand for, this is maybe what we don't stand for. And anybody who comes to be involved, make sure they're aware of those things is one possible way. Because, the old saying is, if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. I think whenever you put it together an organization, it must have a goal. It must stand for something, and it's your job to try to put that together in a way that you can communicate to other people.
Well, I do think that the literature that you've created is very good for this. I definitely agree that having people read through that, and if they process it and they're on board with all of that, then we shouldn't have a problem. But of course, people might misunderstand things, or they might just forget, or I think we have a fair number of people that probably never read the literature from what I've seen. Some are more committed and will read through that. Some will not. And all of those people are valuable. I think we have lots of good people that aren't necessarily thinking the same way we are, and we have to kind of guide them a little bit. And I guess one thing I want to note here, though, is you mentioned that what we're trying to do is not implement National Socialism, but there's nothing in our sort of vision that says that someone who has those political views can't be a member. And so I think that is where you want to get to. You want to get to the point where people that have different views are able to all work together for the big picture, for the big goal. And it can be difficult to get them there. The more rigid their thinking is, the harder it's going to be.
Yeah, and there's one thing you missed earlier in your list of possibles, that they didn't read the literature, they didn't understand it, or whatever. Sometimes people have their own agendas, and they're hoping you're going to play into their agenda. And that's why, again, I think putting it down in paper and saying, this is what we're about. My view is you don't have to get along with everybody. We don't have to all agree. If what we've said we're doing doesn't work for you, we can still be friends, but we're doing something different.
I think you encounter the what you were saying about National Socialists. You encounter that with all different kinds of people. You'll encounter it with people who are either Christian or pagan, people who are National Socialist or they're libertarian. We would be perfectly comfortable with those people as long as they were a good person, as long as they viewed our end goal as more important than their ideology. But I think this is what people refer to as LARPing. I think what it really means is that you, for some reason, you as a person have decided that, wearing this certain image and doing certain certain body movements and that is more important to you than this overall goal. And that if that gets in the way, that can't be tolerated. You can believe in those things as long as they come, as long as the end goal is paramount to you.
Yeah, I agree. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go back to this presentation and just maybe we'll do that. We'll bounce around and discuss a couple things.
That works pretty well, I think.
In this presentation, again, I'm going to reference the company as a line. They said step one is prevent. And I think what they mean is get people, they use the term emotional, what is that? Emotional quotient, right? So IQ, EQ. Get people who are emotionally stable and people who have problem-solving skills. So that's their first step is prevent. And I agree, that's a good way. Then the next thing they say is whenever a conflict does arrive, stop, take a break, don't get all headstrong, think about what's going on, remove the emotion from the situation, and try to think, what am I really trying to accomplish here? And, we don't have to be in open conflict and fighting about a particular issue. Since they got all these lined up real quickly, let me go through the next one. The next one is define the problem. They say emotions may cloud the real issue. So just try to understand what is the real problem here. So what do I want? What do you want? How can we kind of come to some agreement on what we're doing? Like I said, usually it has to start with vision. You have to agree we're working towards the same vision, and then you can have an effective communication. But if you don't have the same vision right off, maybe you don't belong together. And that's all I'm going to bring up at this point for that.
So I think with that, one thing that I think we probably can talk about now is the sort of religious difference issue that we've run into, because this is something where I think that high emotional quotient, emotional intelligence, has helped us a lot, but it is really important that people, that their goal is aligned with our goal. And as an example, we have, I think we've mentioned before that we have Christians, we have Christian identity, we have pagans, we have atheists and agnostics. And I think as long as, if you have a religion that a lot of people, they believe in their religion very strongly, and they want it to spread, right? They want other people to believe that too, because they think that would be better for them. And the problem with that is, well, I mean, that's fine, but it can't really be a thing that you're trying to push in a group like this. You really have to kind of separate that out. And I think that one thing we've done is we allow people to express their religion to a certain extent. If they want to have a prayer before a meal, that's perfectly acceptable. I think that's worked pretty well. If people want to do a couple different prayers to respecting multiple different religious beliefs, I think that works pretty well. I think that, the one thing that people will sometimes look at that and go, oh, this feels like the diversity sort of garbage that is pushed on us elsewhere, right? Where, oh, we have to have a Muslim and a Sikh, and
Right. It's not like you're letting me pray to Allah before the meal.
Exactly. But in my opinion, I think what we've done so far has been pretty effective, and I would say as long as it's a historically white religion, it's acceptable. That's sort of my view in this, and as long as people can subordinate it while they're in the group to the goal of a future for white people.
Right. For me personally, in everything, I kind of look at it as, is it good for white people? Is it neutral towards white people? Or is it bad for white people? And in our group, all of our religions revolve around either being neutral or good for white people. If somebody came in and was preaching a bunch of universalist, that everyone is good and we need to have a Sikh and a Muslim guy and all, that's not going to be the kind of guy, A, that comes to our group anyway, but B, that it'd be like you would have to talk to them and say, when you're with us, this can't be the point of why you're here.
Well, and I would say, yeah, and taking that sort of train of thought, Islam, I would say, is an anti-white religion. So we're not going to allow someone to pray to Allah at our events. We really don't want you within the group if you've decided to follow this foreign anti-white religion. But if you're one of these other sort of things that are, as you said, either pro-white, neutral towards whites, then those can both be acceptable.
Going back, I'll just be quick about this. Going back to the third point, which is identifying the real problem. Something that I've noticed pretty often is that disagreements that people will have, especially online, because you're in some Telegram group and you're banging out a message really quick, and you don't think about your wording, you don't think about your phrasing. What happens is that, a word here or there might be just a little bit off. And then the other person will read your message and they'll think, that's ridiculous. Why would you use these words? You must have bad intentions. And then that person gets heated. They use the wrong words. It keeps, so it may not even be that it's not the same question that they're trying to have an answer to. It's that there's just a semantic difference.
Right, an interpretation problem.
Yeah. And that can be destructive if people get emotional, because sometimes they're not really arguing over anything.
And it's actually been a lot easier in person than it is in those online interactions.
Most definitely.
Because people tend to be just better about that and choose their words more carefully when there's another human standing in front of them. So we haven't had like big conflict here. It's just there is occasional, we've seen some occasional tension, I guess, a little bit. But people are generally pretty good about it. So I'm not trying to, I guess just for those out there that are trying to set up a group, this is not something you have to be terrified of, but you will encounter it, and you probably will get someone that is entirely too dogmatic and just won't let something go, right? So you have to be aware that as long as people can demonstrate emotional intelligence and just manage their emotions with each other and be courteous, that it can work. But they can't be, if they're completely autistic, then this is not, then they really have to be out of the group. They have to be able to handle some differences and some conflict.
So the next slide going on, just if nobody's got anything particular. So they talk about active listening without forming a response, don't make assumptions, minimize distractions, and ask questions. So I think what they're saying is when you're confronted with conflict like this, try to understand what the other person wants. Doesn't necessarily mean give in what they want, understand it. And once you understand it, then you can make a decision. Can this work with us? Do we need to get rid of this person? is there a way that we can make this work out for everybody? You know, so it's a win-win, quote unquote. One other thing I did want to comment on is, I mean, our cause, our people's cause, we are in a condition where we do have people who are actively opposed to what we're trying to do. And, you know, I want to avoid certain language here, but it's pretty typical for state security forces to send in infiltrators to study groups and understand their dynamics. And I've got some personal experience. So in some cases, you're going to meet people who are completely unreasonable because they're being paid to be unreasonable. And again, at some point, you have to be willing to say, we just got to go, or you got to go, or we got to go somewhere else. There's no basis when somebody is too difficult. And again, I guess it relates in much the same way to something you said earlier, was that a certain amount of mutual respect. Because if I'm willing to respect someone who is National Socialist, for example, and say, yeah, you can be involved in our activities if you want to be, but also respect me that I'm not National Socialist and I don't want you using this as an event for that particular activity. So yes, you can be part of our community, but this community has other goals, just slightly different. I think that and ultimately they have the same goals, but again, it comes down to how does that happen.
Just to add really quickly, I think you see this a lot online where not only will there be an infiltrator, a bad actor, or just somebody who's seeking attention or trolling, they might even gain a following. They might get, this would be more unlikely in real life, but online happens all the time. Somebody comes into our movement, quote unquote, and they just start grabbing people and, we need to fight the other side of our group because they don't believe that this certain political ideology is the way to go. And that means that we're going to fail and that, we have to take them down before we fight the real enemy that we're all trying to fight. I think that is the real danger in letting someone like that stay. Yeah. Is that then that is going to plague everyone else in your group, and I guess that's what you would call subversion.
I would like to say something I've found kind of interesting in the what I would call intellectual and religious diversity that we have in our group is that it's led me to look into things that I normally wouldn't have. I've looked into actual, like, what is National Socialism? Other than told Nazis bad. That's literally my entire history. Yeah. Through school, Nazis bad. The end. So I've looked into it. It's interesting. Am I a National Socialist? No, I am not. It's also led me to look into like Christian identity because I had no comprehension of what that was. And again, it's kind of broadened some of my thoughts on the world in general, history, religion and everything. So you do get huge benefits by having more diverse intellectual and religious people in your group, as long as you're not fighting a dogmatic battle all the time when you're together.
Yeah, and one other thing which I think we've tried to do explicitly is not just be a re-recruitment of the same movement people into a different organization. If we're going to attain our goals, we have to bring more people into our movement, into our nationalist cause, whatever you want to call it. And there's going to be a lot of variety there, and some ideas are not going to be acceptable to certain other people. But I think that there is a place, like I said, in terms of vision, we all agree that our people should be together and strong and whole, and we're looking for a grand future for white people, European peoples in North America. So I think when you start there, there's a commonality. Now, how that's going to happen, again, we got to be, yes, you've got to let other people in, with their own particular views, but you can't let those people scare away other people.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, because that is exactly why, it was necessary to head off that very strident political recruitment that was happening. I think that was important because we have people there that are really not. I mean, they haven't been in this movement at all previously. They have no history with it. And if you show them a bunch of fairly extreme political views, they're going to say, "Oh, this isn't for me." And I think we've done a pretty good job of recruiting people who were even neutral pretty recently on the issue of diversity and non-white immigration into America. They would have said, "Well, it's okay," but they're changing their minds a little bit because of recent events, and we're picking up some of those people. And so I think that it's really important to keep it not a neutral space, but just a space that's just pro-white and doesn't have a lot of the other baggage attached to it, while still, people are going to talk about details of World War II. That's a thing that a lot of people end up learning about as a result of this, and that's fine. But we want to make sure that doesn't become everything the group is about, and that it's not an echo chamber, and that it doesn't lead to a political ideology that is something that is really rigid and focused on some exact details of how we're going to achieve this.
Yeah, and I mean, like for example, someone does not have to say, I don't know. I don't want to pick particular things and talk against them, but let's just say there's some particular ideas. Someone new into this. I mean, our people have been beaten down, and we are a defeated people at this point, and our people are largely afraid to exert and proclaim their existence as a people. And, we got to be tender to some of our people. We got to give them a chance to experience real community before they can involve themselves in whatever they want to be involved in. But if we can help people just find community, to be part of something real, that's what I think is important.
Yeah, I think that the concept of community first and then politics, you have to keep that in mind. For a lot of people, they will never be involved in politics, and that is fine. That's even good. You don't want everyone being so political all the time. So I think community first is something to have in your head as you're trying to organize a group like this.
Yeah, and just, I think I mentioned it a couple shows ago, kind of a doctrine that I think kind of expresses that is, political power comes from a social base supported by an economic base. So it's this social and community and the economics behind it that support it that will allow you to exert politics. But for too many organizations out there, they go to politics and they have no underlying community. I think it needs to be the other way. You start a community, then those people will express their political views, and will use that in the normal political system to make conditions better for our people in the future.
I think it comes down to what we're lacking. I don't think that we're lacking a political. I mean, you could say that we don't have a party that truly represents us, but that's not truly what we're lacking. What we're truly lacking is community. That's how they destroyed our communities
and identity.
Right.
If we had community and identity, we'd have politics.
Yeah.
Right.
Of course.
Right. Yeah, there are plenty of organizations out there, and whatever approach people want to take, I'm fine with that. But, for us, what we're trying to do is build community, have regular social events, picnics, get-togethers that are not strictly political. Especially, I would like to see a lot more movement towards cultural events where, culture and history are also focused on. And that's why I really like your music that you bring. I mean, that's culture, and that helps people experience their own culture very positively.
I think music is a good example of something that's been taken from us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've found that community, even in our own documents, community is really what the goal is. We don't have a political platform in any of our documents. We don't have any religious platforms in any of our documents. It's about us coming together as people that are historically Our ancestors came from Europe. They came to North America. We created what was America, the old America, not the current
I would say
one.
we are America.
We are America, yeah. As I think it was Cicero or one of those in Rome had pointed out, he pointed out that there were so many new Romans that they were just the stepchildren of Rome. They were not Roman.
Yeah.
He even the Romans at the time said these are not Romans. They are the stepchildren of Rome that the emperor has said is now Roman because they were willing to fight for him.
It's incredible the sort of parallels you find between Rome and America.
And all throughout history, actually, almost every empire has gone through this. The Habsburgs went through the same thing. Every big empire went through these things where they started off as a tiny group of ethnically the same homogenous people who grew and grew. They got more power, and then somebody along the lines decided, I can get more power if I allow that other group in, and that group, and this group. And then suddenly there is no group anymore, and the empire collapses because there is no central core group anymore.
And that's why, personally, I'm actually anti-imperialist. I think the will to empire is a very bad thing for people.
100%
The will
agree.
to nationhood, that to me is the greatest thing that can be. A people striving to maintain their nationhood, to maintain their culture, their identity from now and into the future, great thing. But trying to build a multi-ethnic empire of people who may or may not like each other, it's guaranteed to fail in my mind. It works great for a while because it creates a lot of economic opportunity and growth, but at a certain point, people stop caring about the economics and they start looking for their own community. And I think that's ultimately why every empire
And that's
falls.
just a bigger example of the kind of conflict we're talking about.
Yeah.
That's how empires fail, is through conflict within the group. The empire itself cannot get along. So you now taking that down to the micro where we're building groups, if you have a couple of bad people in them that will not allow the group to have its own goal and move towards that goal and want to make it about themselves and what their goals are, that's how you blow up a group, just like how you blow up a country or an entire empire.
Yeah, and we've, not in our group, but in other groups, I've seen this where you have people that they're I guess they're LARPing. They're LARPing about, well, once we have power, we're going to form an empire and all this. And I've been really tempted to fight them on it because I also agree with you, Mr. Ed, that empire is a disaster. The empire is what destroys nations. But I've resisted the urge to argue about this because we don't have power. We're not going to have power in our lifetimes to have an empire. So why should I fight this person on a topic that's totally irrelevant? I let them have their dreams because it's just not relevant to me or really to them. But who cares?
And one kind of cultural reference that I would like to, when I see Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and I ask myself, what is the ring? To me, the ring is this will to empire, and it always whispering to you, you can be greater and more powerful and stronger, but it has an evil side effect that destroys you. And maybe that was or wasn't his intention. I know in some ways he was talking about just, will to power in some ways, is he being Tolkien, but I think it's also good to think about it as, the empire is appealing, but it's also very dangerous.
I think with Lord of the Rings, there are positive examples of powerful men who do exert their will to power. I'm sure there are problems with that whole book series, but I would agree with you that is a proper assessment.
Another one I'd like to bring up is Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden. It's a great poem. You really need to look at it. And it was
you were talking about this on our last hike that we did.
It's always presented as being this empire is a great thing and necessary. And maybe that's what he was saying. But when I read it, Kipling is warning against empire. He's saying, take up the... First of all, there's a subtitle. Look at what the subtitle of The White Man's Burden is. It says U.S. Congress, and it gives 18 something or other. he's talking about discussions that were actually going on in the U.S. Senates and the House of Representatives. And there were people who saying, we have a white man's burden to help bring up all these, non-white people and lead them to the promised land or whatever. And in this poem, he's saying, beware of that. Yes, it's very compelling to say I want an empire, but, and I'm realizing, and if it's okay with you, we need to be careful about not, the thing was this difficult people. And should we bring this back to this?
Yeah, that makes sense.
I apologize. I guess I diverged. I'm going to, so in this aligned document, they talk about the communication model. And so they talk about there being two things, someone who is sending a message and somebody who is receiving the message. And each person they're calling filters that each person is going to interpret things in a certain way that's going to disallow a message in its pure form being communicated from one person to another. And I think what they're trying to say is, be careful how you phrase what you're saying when conflict exists. Step 4 in their program is determine ideal outcomes. What are you, and I think we've talked about that vision. What are you really trying to accomplish, each of you? So they're saying determine ideal outcomes. What is the ideal outcome for each party? What is the probability each person will get what they want? And then they're saying step 5 is negotiate a compromise. What are the common overlapping goals? What can each person live with? So anyways, I think that was basically this whole presentation. And personally, I find a lot of these kinds of things useless. But I thought it was, just for completeness, let's try to, bring in communications and conflict experts and include that into our discussion.
Yeah, I think that was good to sort of help guide it. I think that I guess one thing with all of this, you mentioned that this is in kind of a corporate structure where everyone is employed and there's some power over the individual that management has here. And you're not going to have that in a volunteer organization in the same way. What replaces that hierarchy is leadership. And there has to be within your group, someone has to be sort of exerting some amount of positive leadership. You have to have an attitude of leadership, and you have to be willing to go in and do this conflict resolution if you need to, right? If you have to recognize that there's a problem, and then you have to try to do something about it. And you have to understand that it's volunteer association. People aren't being required to be here. You don't have anything over them. And so I think that is a tricky thing. Leadership is a whole other topic that I don't want to get into too much, but leadership is kind of the way that you get these sort of things to happen in a volunteer association.
Well, within the leadership, I find with volunteer organizations, leaders will kind of almost become, I wouldn't say self-appointed, but appointed by the group, in that they'll look to that person. But in that leadership, that's where you have to be able to show that you're willing to compromise with others and understand what they're talking about and not get into big arguments. It's when your leaders get into big arguments that suddenly then everyone will think, well, that's how this group runs, is we just argue about things. And it's like, no, if those that are seen as leadership are seen as compromising, are seen as let's have a discussion rather than an argument about stuff, and that's the way it goes every time, then the rest of the people that are just there to have a good time and may not even be there for politics or anything else, just for community, they're going to follow that kind of model when they see, oh, well, the guy who leads this organization, or I perceive as a leader in the organization, handles it this way. That's the way it's meant to be handled in this group.
I think it will also help if you're being reasonable about these sort of things where we're having discussions rather than arguments. If there's something that is important, if there's something that you can't compromise on, right? Someone saying like, oh, well, I want to bring in this group of non-whites into our pro-white group. And then when you're, okay, I can't compromise on that. People will understand that you're a reasonable person that has a set of priorities straight. and they'll take that, that rigidity in that particular case. They'll take it much better because it's not you're always rigid about everything. It's that you are expressing that this is what's important.
So kind of bringing it around back to like difficult people. So so difficult people have trouble compromising. They have trouble reciprocating that if you're willing to give something up, that they're willing to give something up. And so that would be what are difficult people and how do you deal with them? One, first try to find some basis for reciprocal cooperation or whatever. My view is always seek that. Try to get that. If you can't, then just admit we have irreconcilable differences or something. There's nothing wrong with that.
And it just depends on how important the subject is that you're discussing as to whether or not you can even work together.
Yeah.
Because, I think we've all met people in life where it's like they will not compromise, period, and they'll make everything about that subject, and instead of getting on with the rest of the work that needs to be done, they want to constantly fight that subject until you just give in. And in that case, that's the kind of person you may want to help find the exit, and feel free not to come back.
And the thing about them finding the exit is that it's not necessarily guaranteed that that's the end for them, that they won't do anything to help us in the future. Doesn't mean that you will end up inviting him back to your group. Maybe you won't. Maybe he goes off to a different group and it's explicitly this thing and he's got all of his friends with him that completely agree with him. Well, good for him. Maybe
that turns out even better for him.
Maybe they'll actually do something to help our end goal. And at the same time, you're not burdened with having someone around you which you just can't agree with, because it will drag you down. It'll eat you up inside. It'll just it'll be if it becomes a priority for you and this person that you disagree with, it's just going to be so much more harm than good.
Yeah.
So
I think as an example of this, a difficult person, one person I've met in another organization, another setting, is an extreme racial purist. Wanting to know if there's 1% or whatever of something in someone's bloodline. Oh, that's really bad. Well, you don't want to have kids with that person or whatever. That person I would never invite to our group because they're never able to compromise on stuff. I mean, to an extent that I don't think any of us remotely agree with, but also just it's a level of fixation that is just not productive. And so I think when you see something like that, yeah, maybe there are groups that are appropriate for someone that has those views and is that fixated on this topic. It's not. I would say in general, if you're wanting to make a big or a reasonably big tent group that can really have potential for the future, you don't want that person there.
Going back to what you were saying earlier, if you were to bring that person who's this racial purist who, it seems to always be talking about this, and you've got a newcomer with you, like we usually do, I can't imagine being that person who has just showed up to this new group. Maybe you're a young person, maybe you're a girl, and you open yourself up and you take a risk by going to this group, and you're just hoping that they're reasonable people, and then all of a sudden you've got this man who includes you in this conversation. He's very activated by the idea that someone can't have this this percentage of ancestry. That will just scare off people. And the tent doesn't have to be huge. The tent doesn't have to be the grand old party, but the tent can't be one person.
And I would also say is we don't need a single tent, right? We can have lots of little tents that all together are working towards the same kind of vision, and maybe not even the exact same vision. So we can work with people as long as they're willing to work with us that we disagree with on certain things.
Yeah, I think that there can certainly be organizations that are in parallel with ours that we work with going forward, who we don't agree with on everything. And I think that you're right, that ultimately it's going to take that. But I do think that, I guess, I don't want to talk about, how big to make your tent, but yeah, you want it as big as it can be while accomplishing your goal. And I won't go into the details of what that means, but I think that, we're pro-white, and I think that means that you do accept things like there's some people that have some amount of non-white ancestry, but they're overwhelmingly white. Okay, you're white. There have to be organizations that have that sort of position, and so that's the position we take. But I think it's fine if there's someone that has a really, really purist view. I don't think that organization is going to be as successful and able to actually pursue the big picture goal as well as a result of that. But we have different views. We have different, slightly different priorities in that sense.
So kind of getting back two things. So in this presentation I used, they talked about the first step is preparing, and they talked about selecting people who have high emotional quotient. And then we also talked about one of the first things to dealing with difficult people is to set a common vision. The next thing I would say that's important, and this is all preparatory before you encounter this difficult person, is put processes for decision making and organizational structure in place, so that if you have no hierarchy, no organizational structure, anybody's opinion is as good as anybody else's. But if we all agree we're here for this purpose, and this is how we're going to conduct our business, and these are the people, this is the process we're going to use to come to decisions, then when a difficult person comes in, they don't want to follow the processes. I'm willing to bet. This is my experience. So your processes in preparation of defining your vision and defining your processes early will help you deal with difficult people. They'll either accept your vision and accept your processes, or they won't, and they have no place in your big tent.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is make it clear early on, and that helps things. If there's less ambiguity, people can tell if they are okay with getting on board with this or not.
I mean, just take an example of a church, everybody always presumes and knows, this is what a church is. But anybody can walk in the door and, spout off, today the religion is about this. But nobody accepts that person as having any authority, of having any reasonable role in, and the very fact that they're looking for something other than is there in that church proves that they don't belong there. So that, again, defining the vision, setting up some processes for decision making and leadership. It's difficult in a small organization. It becomes necessary as the organization gets larger.
Yeah, I think it's been great at our gatherings that we've had literature out. As a matter of fact, this last picnic when I showed up, there were a couple of new people, and they were both reading. They were reading our foundational documents.
Yeah, I like that.
And it's like, yeah, before you can really become part of the group and interact, you better know what it is.
Yeah.
And we make that absolutely clear. It's not, well, just talk to Joe over there and he'll tell you what our group is. It's like, no, here's the manual. Here's literally the document of what we stand for.
And we absolutely intend on working with other organizations in the future. I don't think that the ENA should directly be involved in electing candidates, but we can work with organizations that do see themselves in that role, and we can help our people who want to be involved in politics to focus them towards organizations that we've determined, these are people who have good values and a good plan, and they're going to move forward, and we'll help them.
So do we have, I guess, did that cover pretty much what you wanted to go over today, Ed, or?
I guess so, yeah. I mean, when I originally thought about this, I was thinking really difficult people. How do you deal with people who are downright dangerous? But
when you get to that point, they should have been shuffled out of the group anyway.
I mean, yeah, we've had a random person shuffle on up and in those situations, you just as quietly and as with as little interaction as possible, you shuffle that person along. So I mean that wasn't a really difficult person. I think that later on maybe we'll talk about how to deal with concerted opposition, shall we say?
Security type operations.
Security type. People that are a problem for security. Yeah, we haven't really had that, and I think that that's a different topic. But I wanted to kind of talk. I wanted to keep this focused on you're building a community, you're building a group, and very early on, you are absolutely going to have these sort of dumb conflicts, especially in this sort of movement, because there's all this history and baggage that so many people have, and they have this political ideology that they're attached to, and they have their religion that they're attached to, and all these things are so important to them, and they're convinced they know the right way. So that is going to be a thing that I think almost every group is going to encounter. So I wanted to kind of get this one out there early.
I think it was a good topic. I think it was interesting. Hopefully it'll be interesting to anybody listening to this.
All right. Well, I think we'll kind of sign off here. I think it's been about an hour. I didn't really keep track of the time this time, but I think it was probably a pretty good amount of time and a good discussion. So I guess I'll let everyone kind of sign off.
This is Mr. Ed signing off. Goodbye.
Have a good one.
Mr. Black, and I'm out of here.
All right. Well, thank you for listening, and we'll be back in a month.